Good morning, APUSH. Welcome to day 3 of our remote learning program. Yesterday, we discussed protests over Vietnam, specifically looking at the perspective of Martin Luther King as a civil rights activist and John Kerry, a Vietnam veteran who had a very different firsthand experience going through the Vietnam War. Today, we are going to be continuing to look at the home front during the Vietnam War. Specifically, our main inquiry of the day is, how does the Vietnam War heighten political and social tension in the United States? So again, as I have with the past couple days, I'm going to give you guys some context. We're actually going to watch an outside video, and then you guys are going to transition into your class packets looking at more historical documents. So before we get started, make sure you have some loose leaf paper, either in your Cornell notebook or in your history binder, prepared to take some lecture notes, and have a writing utensil, and make sure that your workspace is good to go during this part of the lecture. You should also have your classwork document up, so that way, in case you have any questions, you can do a quick sneak peek of that during, and you can pause this lecture to take a sneak peek at what we are doing today. Give you a moment to get that stuff together while I start to share our screen. Great, so as I've said, today we are looking at the Vietnam War. Today should be Thursday, March 19th. And I'm going to ask you guys to pause this video, take 4 minutes, please review these key terms. Again, you have 4 minutes to do so. Go ahead and pause. Great, you guys should be back after taking 4 minutes to do a quick oral drill, specifically the Kent state shooting, the Poor People's Campaign. As all of these are very important terms to understand, specifically the political and social tension that is increased during this time of war. I'm now going to ask, this PBS video has been linked into today's assignment as an external link. You can also click the link in the slides provided for you. Please go ahead and pause my video and pull up this to give some quick context. This is specifically on the protests against the Vietnam War, similar to what we talked about yesterday. And I want you guys to watch this, thinking specifically in the part of the question today that is, how did the Vietnam War heighten social tension in the United States? So go ahead and pause, keep that framing question in mind, and transition to the video. Great, we should be back. Everybody should have done a 4-minute oral drill, and everybody should have watched that 5-minute video. We now, between yesterday and that external information, we should have a pretty good idea as to how social tension was heightened during the Vietnam War. And so I'm going to now walk us through the political tension. I'm going to move my screen. There we go, right under the protesters. So there is a lot of political discontent. As a reminder, you should have paper out and a writing utensil so you can be sure to take notes during the lecture. So during the 1960s, there is a lot of political discontent. I know a recurring question that has come up in class is, when does the Republican Party and when does the Democratic Party start to look more like the Democrats and the Republicans of today, as opposed to the 1860s, where you have the Southern racist Democrats and the Northern abolitionist Republicans? And in the 1960s is where we really start to see the true nature of the political parties we have today start to unfold. And this comes through a variety of different aspects. So first, I'm going to look at the Democratic National Convention. This is in 1968. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson officially declares that he will not run for re-election, which is very unprecedented. When a president is able to run for re-election and they're sitting in office, they usually do that. So for Johnson to decide not to run for re-election, this really shows specifically how Vietnam was completely plaguing his presidency. And despite the success of the Great Society, he was stuck. So he chose to go to chose to not run for re-election. And the Democrat that was the clear right choice was not the man in the picture, but it was his vice president Humphreys. He was very loyal to Lyndon Johnson. It was just kind of a clear choice, even if he wasn't the popular choice. And so the Democratic National Convention is where Humphreys officially became the Democratic nominee. However, this was met with a lot of uproar from young Democrats, specifically the new left that we've been discussing the last couple days. So the new left, specifically young Democrats that were fighting against the Vietnam War, those that are protesting against the Vietnam War, they at the National Convention began to protest the National Convention because they believe that Humphreys will not stop the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. So this is really important, where we see this split between traditional Democrats that tend to follow people like Johnson and Humphreys, and this new young Democrat generation that is fighting for change, specifically through these protests against Vietnam. During this election, we also see the evolution of the third party. So we've talked about third parties in the past, like the know-nothings, the free soilers, the populists. George Wallace becomes the most notable figure of a third party in the 20th century in terms of elections. He was an anti-integration, so he was very pro-segregation in the South, and he is actually the Alabama governor that tries to stop the integration of the University of Alabama, which we discussed in the Civil Rights Movement. I have this picture of him where he has the Confederate flag in the background, just to emphasize that he is appealing to the traditional segregationists of the South. So this is what I mean where we start to see that split of political parties. You have these young Democrats fighting against the Vietnam War and fighting for the Civil Rights Movement, which alienate those racist segregationists of the traditional Democratic Party. And they find an ally in George Wallace. So this is where we start seeing those segregationists, those allies of racial tension. They start to leave this new progressive Democratic Party and start to follow people like George Wallace. George Wallace also shows us an example of somebody actively going against the two-party system. So remember that the two-party system is where we have the Republicans and the Democrats. And you kind of have to choose which side you're going to be on. George Wallace shows that these racist traditional Democrats do not want to be a Democrat anymore, but they also aren't ready to be Republicans either. So he gives them a place to go. Building on that, we are going to look at the election of 1968. As you can see, it was pretty close between Humphreys and Nixon, but George Wallace got a lot of those orange states, as you can see in the map, where he got those, where we were discussing those segregationists, those traditional racists of the Democratic Party. This is where they are not voting for the blue Humphrey. They are voting for George Wallace. We also see the return of Richard Nixon. We discussed Richard Nixon in his debates between himself and JFK during the 1960 election, where he did not win, even though he was a pretty reasonable candidate at the time. He was Eisenhower's vice president. He was a traditional Republican, and he was a clear voice of the Republican Party. And I know we like to discuss Nixon in terms of his Watergate scandal, and don't worry, we'll get to that. But this is when he is still a pretty popular man in terms of a traditional Republican look. And he runs for president on this idea of law and order. And so what he means by law and order, not the TV show, is that he is going to bring back comfort and traditionalism back to the United States. Remember, the 1960s is this time of mass protest between the Civil Rights Movement, the the women's liberation movement. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the LGBTQIA plus movement. He sees all of these protests and that they are destroying the United States. So he runs on this premise that he will bring back law and order, that the United States will go back to that traditional, quote unquote, safe 1950s again. And he does this by appealing to what he calls the silent majority. And so what the silent majority refers to is you have all of these very loud vocal protesters going against what they see as going wrong in the country, whether that be Vietnam, women's liberation, or the civil rights movement. He looks at those people and says that they are the minority, but they are the most vocal. They are a vocal minority, which is why we discuss them and why we have to talk about them more. He puts them in opposition with this silent majority that, while they might not think civil rights is a bad thing, they might agree that, Vietnam isn't going as well as it should be. He puts these two groups in opposition of each other, and he appeals to this silent majority, the moderates, the people that don't want to protest. They just want things to go back to normal and push for this return to complacency and normality of the 1950s. And again, during the 1960s is such a tumultuous time. That is how he is able to win the presidency, is by pushing for this idea that we should go back to a comfortable normality similar to what we had in the 1950s. So all of the social progress that we make in the 1960s, while yes, it is occasionally violent, and while yes, it is occasionally uncomfortable, all of that progress gets undone by his desire to stop it in order to return back to that 1950s false sense of comfort. And what's important to know as Nixon wins the presidency and becomes president in 1969 is this is where we see that shift from the progressive 1960s into a more traditional and conservative 70s and 80s. So this is where it's in Nixon's election, and it's through Nixon's election and the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy where we see the end of this progressive 1960s. Now, I know that we want that when I introduced this lesson, I was specifically talking about Vietnam. Let me go ahead and actually stop sharing my screen. I know when I introduced this lesson, we were talking about Vietnam and specifically how Vietnam heightens this political tension. I'm hoping that through this external information of what is happening politically in the 1960s, that you can see in these primary source documents why political tensions are becoming such an issue. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Make sure you utilize these external notes. Again, remember you are doing full annotations on those documents. There are places underneath those documents for you to put those annotations in, and be sure to complete the exit ticket with a thesis statement and a contextualization statement. Those instructions are all in your Google Doc. I will be on Zoom from 11:15 till noon. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll be there and happy to help you. See you guys there.